Because there's an urgent need for us to reject the reigning energy regime of fossil fuel extraction, a group of authors and academics recently got together to imagine pathways out of our current impasse. The outcome of that meeting was this 6-episode podcast series.
In the context of the carbon-intensive university and the university's service to a variety of environmentally unjust and destructive industries and practices, how do we maintain fidelity to that first ideal, right, when our practice as academics simultaneously implicates us in that second characteristic of the academy? How do we escape it? Or how should we or can we capitalize on it?
We've talked about the doubts that some of us have about the efficacy of what we do theoretically and how it then extends into practice outside the university, to interrogate systems that many of us will just sort of naturally fall into because we have to earn bread, right? We have to feed families and ourselves. And so to me, I think we're reliving many of the huge concerns that students back in the volatile 1960s had with the university. And that is that the university is becoming too much of a machine.
I think that's the point of why we are talking about the museum here, because the museum is fundamentally a place where the past evidence is stored, interpreted, and presented to the public. And that's where various methodologies can be, trialed and brought to the public. That's what we want to do as scholars. We don't want just to talk about those things in the closed rooms. We want to bring this conversation to the open space, engage with people.
So I think we need to cultivate more spaces of kind of meaningful deliberation discussion. This podcast is one attempt to do that, actually, to spark some deliberation about how do we kind of come together and envision ways to respond to these challenges.
You often hear that we have the technologies that we need, right? Mm-hmm. So we have the ideas that we need, we have the technologies that we need, and what we lack is the politics. We do not have the politics that we need.
I guess what I'm asking is there a stuckness about where we're at?
I think there are a lot of moments, like people have been talking recently around the pandemic too, that these crises open up potentially these moments of vulnerability where something new can be brought into being. But we also see just like the incredible ways in which, whether it is a certain form of industrial agriculture or the oil industry manages to be incredibly stubborn through these periods of vulnerability. And in many ways, I think of it a little bit like a contest of stubbornness. And one of the things that I did want to talk to as well is just about the treaties in Treaty 4 territory in particular, where I live, which are the agreements that allow for settler existence in those lands and were signed in this case in Treaty 4 in 1874. And the sort of steadfastness and stubbornness of the descendants of the original signers of those agreements from indigenous nations about what those agreements mean, and really bringing forward that interpretation and being really stubborn and uncompromising on that over time. And so I think a little bit about how the transition is really about who can be most stubborn, who can make their ideas most durable.
One of the first questions we've been thinking about is how to produce mass support for a transition away from fossil fuels, which we understand to be a transition not just away from specific energy sources, but towards a whole different set of social relations and ways of organizing ourselves in society. And we've been thinking about how to build that support across different scales. So oftentimes, energy transition is conceived in terms of individual choices about consumption, behavior, etc. But we also want to think about what it means to build support for large-scale social transformations at other scales: city, state, federal, global.
I see it as doing the work of petroleum, right? It's doing the work of extending a petro ethos, right? And I see this in the Children's Museum where there's information. I mean, they start from like under the sea, right? And so they bring you into this kind of imaginative landscape where you're below the sea at the moments, millions of years ago when petrol was being, created by these, plants and animals that have, and then it brings you across time to the present and then into the future of new energy futures. But the transition between those, I think, is very intentionally smooth, right? You just kind of move very smoothly and nicely and evenly from one to the next. And that to me, like even in a transition to something like wind or solar without a recognition of kind of loss or something like that, that's still doing the work of petroleum.
The hope of a better future somehow still seems to be tied with reviving the old industry and not really going towards renewables, because I think the transition toward renewables, so like solar or wind, also entail different ways of understanding how we build political relationships, because oil also forms how we relate with politics and how the state has access to the wealth of the land.
So I think fossil fuels right now are very constitutive of this form of capitalism, but not all capitalisms as they have historically existed, and certainly not all future capitalisms. What I think is arguably maybe more necessarily tied to the logic of capitalism is a non-reciprocal, I'm thinking a lot about dependency. So I think relations of dependency are inherent to life, and capitalism relies upon non-mutual, non-reciprocated dependencies, both of labor. So that's why, for me, feminists are really important to thinking about all the so-called reproductive and care labor, but also the quote-unquote labor of the earth and the things in the earth that can be put to work, which could be lithium for batteries.
When I teach African American literature in the environment, because of what I just said, I really try to bring a kind of balance to the classroom between kind of horror and beauty, right? And to put it simply, there's moments I think where I try to make room for hope. The Black eco-critical tradition has developed like a really solid image of the complex and sort of multifarious relationship that Black people in the Americas bear to the land, right? Black Americans relate to the environment sort of mediated through histories of slavery, lynching, the overexposure to natural disasters, right, and chemical runoff, right? That goes throughout, the centuries of Black presence in the New World. But I also sort of try to emphasize texts where Black people have deep and engaging relationships with the natural world that allow them to not necessarily transcend like the what seems like a fundamental link between sort of horror and the land, right? But that lets them move that horror somewhere else, right? And put in its place autonomy, right? A sort of autonomous relationship to the natural world.
What we often forget is that there are, in fact, so many, right, like actual existing examples of precisely what we're talking about, right?
Operation Jackson, Guayaba.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, Queremos Sol, Casa Pueblo, and in Puerto Rico right now, who are, are getting back, I mean, not on the grid, not on like, Luna's, that U.S.-Canadian venture, right, is privatizing Puerto Rico and completely destroying their energy infrastructure, right? Like there are these like local grassroots movements that are actually creating these spaces. So like Earthseed, right, Queremos Sol, is actually creating like viable solar-powered collectivist grids that are now powering hospitals. This is actually happening. Actually existing projects that actually aren't only in response to disasters.
Thinking towards the future, I think that these communities are really beginning to think about resilience and
futurity in the face of climate catastrophe, you know, in a way that's much more pressing out west than maybe people in southern Ontario who are having less climatic catastrophes. But, you know, that people are starting to have to think about what I do on my land is going to directly affect everyone else in the valley, and of course all the wildlife who needs a larger corridor than, you know, a certain acreage. So I do think that it's happening. I do think like events like, you know, the smoke or the heat dome, where people had to gather in community centers to breathe cool, clean air, does awaken a different kind of consciousness. But it's pretty entrenched, the individualism and the sense of like survival, individual survival.
Yeah. What is your object for the Museum of the Future? What are you going to place into the end of petroculture?